Well, hello, everyone. I am that Weems guy back here for another episode, and joining me tonight is Mr. Jay Hohenhaus. Jay, if you would introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, I'm Jay Hohnhouse. I'm currently working as a nurse anesthetist in a small community hospital in northern Pennsylvania. I have a background in Army Special Forces. I'm trained as an Army Special Forces medic. I've worked as a emergency department nurse, a flight nurse paramedic, an ICU nurse, and then as a nurse anesthetist for about the last 20 years. My involvement with the modern technique of the pistol dates to about 1975. And I think if I'm not the ultimate Cooper geek, I'm in running for one of the top 3 spots.
All righty. Well, you come highly recommended because Mr. John Hearn suggested that you were the person that I should contact to do a show about Mr. Elden Carl, who passed away recently. Could you tell the audience kind of who was Elden Carl, just a general overview of his life?
Elden Carl was the first superstar of the new sport of combat pistol shooting. Elden came into the sport in 1960. He was only involved in open competition for about 4 years, but he owned those 4 years of open competition. The big event in that was the Big Bear leather slapping contest. Elden won in 1960, 1961, and 1962. There was also the associated Bear Valley Gunslingers Club, which ran monthly competitions, and Elden joined that in the fall of 1960, and by 1962, he had taken the annual title in the Bear Valley Gunslingers. He was also an innovator in technique and equipment. And Elden introduced forward raked holsters to competition. He brought the first fully customized 1911 to combat pistol shooting. He introduced the Hensley and Gibbs number 68 45 cast bullet, which was the mainstay of combat pistol shooting for years. He introduced that into competition. He invented the magazine pad extension on the bottom of magazines. He invented the press check, according to Colonel Cooper.
Cool. Where did he grow up?
Elden grew up around the San Diego area. He grew up in San Diego around El Cajon, around Coronado Island. He was originally he was born in Washington, D.C., but by a young age was in the San Diego area. Outstanding high school athlete, lettered in football. His family setup was less than ideal. He had a father who drank and was fairly violent, and his mom decided that he needed to get out of the house. The story that I've heard was that his mom forged him a birth certificate, making him a couple of years older, and got him into the Navy as still a teenager. And he originally trained as an aviation mechanic, and then they were looking for volunteers to become hospital corpsmen to work with the Marine Corps, and he thought that sounded exciting, so he volunteered for that. He trained at the Naval Hospital in Norco, California, and then deployed with the Fleet Marine Force, getting ready for Korea. The Korean War reached an armistice, and Elden ended up in Guam.
All right. I believe I read somewhere in one of your articles about him that when he was playing football, that for conditioning, he would walk on his hands the whole length of the field.
The story, I've heard the same story from Elden, and he was a fine physical specimen, God-given athletic ability, and then an obsession with pushing himself in training. Eldon was into weightlifting long before it became popular with the 1970s film Pumping Iron. Eldon predated that by about 20 years, but natural gifted athlete, and then a desire to excel, and he trained hard, weightlifting, running, etc. And that's something he kept up most of his life. In his 80s, he was complaining during COVID that the worst thing about COVID was he couldn't get to the gym.
Another story that's out there about him is that when he was in Guam, he entered a boxing match and beat a Golden Gloves guy without any training.
Well, it was worse than that. It was a mandatory intramural boxing competition. And everybody looked at Eldon to represent his unit in this intramural boxing competition. He couldn't get out of it. And he ended up matched against a Golden Gloves boxer from another unit. And Eldon's, whole thing was, this guy knows how to box. I have no idea how to box. This could involve me getting a bad beating. The only way that I'm going to beat this guy is take him out early in the match. If this thing goes long, he's going to deliver a beating on me. So Eldon emphasized weight training. His coaches said, don't do that. You'll become muscle bound. But Eldon was looking for a real powerful opening punch. And so he weightlifted, he ran, and opening portion of the match, he came out of his corner very slowly and reluctantly. And he said he put his eyes down to the ground, down to the mat, as if he didn't want to make eye contact with the guy. His opponent got a big smile on his face and rushed out to deliver the beating. And he dropped his hands as he came close to Eldon, and Eldon snaked one fist out, hit him with everything he could coming from the toes, and it was a one-punch knockout.
Wow.
And the guy went to the canvas, and of course Eldon's unit went wild.
Right.
But he delivered a one-punch knockout against a Golden Gloves boxer.
Outstanding. All right. So then after the Navy is when his law enforcement career started. Is that correct?
So there's about a 4-year gap that I have not figured out what Eldon was doing. And it was only writing his obituary that I started wondering what he did before he, from the time he was discharged from the Navy until the time he started on El Cajon Police Department in 1959. I know he was employed, and I know that he was working on becoming a pistol champion. Well, he was still in the Navy. He went out and bought a 22 caliber single action pistol and started training in the woods around Norco Naval Hospital. In those days, it was very accepted to pull over to the side of the road and fire into a dirt bank in a rural area. So the story is that he bought a copy of Ed McGivern's Fast and Fancy Revolver Shooting, couple of bricks of 22 ammo, and this single action 22, and started practicing. With his discharge, he relocated back to the San Diego area and started competing in pistol matches. He tried the national match courses and sought out Bill McMillan, who was the world champion Marine target shooter, got some instruction from him, found the national match course to be incredibly boring, not what he wanted to do. So he found a fast draw club. And you have to remember in those days that fast draw was a national sport. Fast draw was reported in Sports Illustrated. The American world was crazy about Westerns. They were crazy about anything about the American frontier. There were fast draw, clubs in every community. There were national fast draw championships at the casinos in Las Vegas, which were attended by all of the stars of all of the Westerns being made for television and for movie theaters. So the United States was absolutely crazed about fast draw competition. Eldon will describe to you the difference between fast draw and quick draw. Fast draw is all about the speed of the draw. And there may be nothing in the gun except a blank to make a noise to stop a timer. Then there is quick draw, which is you actually have to hit something. It might be with a wax bullet or it might be with live ammo. In Eldon's scheme of things, the only game going was live ammo. The real men, shot in live ammo matches. So Eldon starts competing in fast draw, quick draw competitions, and makes the acquaintance of another gentleman in El Cajon by the name of Gary Frymiller. Excuse me, Fry Miller, not Mueller, but Fry Miller, resident of El Cajon, about Eldon's age. The two of them meet in Gary's garage to practice. At a previous match, where Eldon took a double action revolver that he had purchased for police work, the two of them practice endlessly with a Faber fast draw timer, fast draw, FASDRAW, which was the hot fast draw timer of the time. Huge, on a pedestal, mechanical timer. It has a switch, it gives a beep, and then it has a microphone and it cuts off when it hears the shot. And it can go down to hundredths of a second, but it's a mechanical timer. And Eldon won one of these timers as a prize at a local fast draw competition. They were giving them as prizes to try to interest people in buying them. Eldon still had the timer on his death, was in his study. But he and Gary Frymiller work endlessly perfecting their draws. Within a year, Gary had won the National Fast Draw Championship in Las Vegas. It was announced in Sports Illustrated January 4th, 1960. So the United States is crazy about fast draw, and it's a mainstream sort of sport. By August of that year, Eldon had won his first leather slap at Big Bear. And so two champions came out of that garage in El Cajon. Eldon always said that he owed a great deal to Gary Frymiller for teaching him the draw. Eldon said with a quick draw, you have more time to devote to shooting. And that served him well over the years. So Eldon has, a background in target shooting, which has taught him sight alignment and trigger control. He can get the gun out quickly. 1959, he gets accepted to the El Cajon Police Department, and 1960, department sends him to the City of San Diego's Police Academy. And he puts in, thousands of rounds in the police academy training, all one-handed point shooting. And Eldon is one of those wonderful freaks of nature that he takes to point shooting and is very good at it. And he has a quick draw. a few months earlier, he had been to the dump at Norco. Somebody told him that Ray Chapman and a 14-year-old single action wonder by the name of Fel Reed were going to be practicing in the dump at Norco. So Eldon drove up to Norco. He knew the area from having been at the Naval Hospital there. And he finds Ray and Fel practicing in the dump. And he's absolutely amazed by both of them. And he observes Fel doing point shooting, from the hip, and notices that the gun wanders around and then freezes on target, doesn't move at all, and Fel will trip the trigger. And that was the key piece of information that Eldon needed to perfect shooting, from the point, from the hip. And so he gets through the police academy, firing thousands of rounds of ammunition paid for by somebody else. And all of this has set him up to do very well in the Big Bear leather slap. In 1959, he planned on entering the leather slap, but he gets there too late. And he pulls into a gas station to ask directions. He's lost, can't find it, and he runs into two leather slap competitors dressed in Western garb with single action pistols holstered on their hip, fast drawing against each other in the parking lot of the gas station, and discovers that the whole thing is already over. And one of the people fast drawing in the parking lot is a gentleman by the name of John Breeding, who we later figured out had just been beaten by Jack Weaver for the leather slap title. Jack Weaver that year had just introduced his two-handed hold, and all of the people in the parking lot were complaining that, one, this guy shot with two hands, and that's not how it's done. And second, the guy was a cop, and cops using double action pistols have no business in these fast draw competitions. So that was Eldon's introduction to the leather slap. The next year, he left early and had worked out his route, and he arrived at the 1960 leather slap with a Model 19 Smith & Wesson in a Jordan Trooper holster that he had custom made so that it had a 11 or 15 degree angle, muzzle forward. He had a pair of modified Smith & Wesson grips on it. Eldon was somebody that prepared obsessively for anything he was going to do, and he looked at his equipment very critically. And to give you the idea of his preparation, he would go out to practice, and his practice range was a gravel pit at the Indian reservation at Verona, California, that he had permission to shoot in. And he noticed that his shirt was binding every time that he would practice his draw. So he went to a tailor and had a shirt made specifically for shooting. Those were the kind of things. It was a constant mantra talking to Eldon was, if there's a piece of equipment that inhibits your performance, do something about the equipment. Don't suffer bad equipment. And if a piece of equipment lets you down, get rid of it and get something that works. As much of a shirt being too tight across the chest, Eldon would work to eliminate that problem.
That along with the story of the guys in the parking lot complaining about Weaver using two hands and all that, it's those same conversations could take place at any match now in 2021.
The last course I went to, the complaints about the people using red dots, were reminded me very much of the conversation of the guy was using two hands and cheating. Another thing that Eldon mentioned, we talked about his friend Gary Freimuller pushing him in training. Eldon said the other thing that you need to become a champion is a nemesis. You need somebody who is good, that drives you to get better and better, somebody who beats you and you work hard to overcome them. He said in his entire competitive shooting career that person was Jack Weaver, that Jack Weaver was such the master of the double action revolver that Jack pushed him to, do better and better. And in the 44 Magnum shoot that we probably should talk about, Jack Weaver, and he tied at least twice, and Eldon, bore down and finally fired that, 100-yard, 3-inch group with a 44 Magnum, only because Jack Weaver, was such a fierce competitor. And so he said, you need a friend to push you to be better and better in practice, and you need a nemesis. You need a competitor who is just top notch to push you to be better and better. And for him, that person was Jack Weaver.
Well, so I'm sitting here now trying to figure out which one of those I am for Hearn, because he made a competition out of the last time we were together, and he didn't win. And so he John, I'm your friend, but I'm your nemesis trying to push you to be better. How about that? I'm sorry, I had to interject that. So when he listens to this, he'll hear that.
I have never shot with John, but I've shot on his targets.
Mm-hmm.
And his mechanical silhouettes are just absolutely evil. So I'm assuming that John is evil as well.
Yeah, we attended a Dave Spalding class together in February of 2020. And one of us earned a buckle on Dave Spalding's famous 2x2x2 drill, and the other one was John Hearn. And John sent me a picture today of a practice session where he got the 2x2x2, and in the time, and basically the drills you got to do, from duty gear or from concealment, 2 shots into a 3x5 card at 20 feet in under 2 seconds. And he sent me a picture of his target with the 2 shots in it and his timer next to it. And I texted back to him that I would let him play with my belt buckle the next time I saw him.
Well, you need to remind him that unless it's in the pressure cooker of competition, it just doesn't matter.
Yeah, but it's more fun to be able to mess with him about it.
Well, of course. John was somebody that I introduced to Eldon. Mm-hmm. John is a member of the Gunsight alumni
yes,
on the internet. And John said that he was going to San Diego for a wedding, and he was thinking about driving up to Big Bear to look for the sites of the leather slap. And could anybody tell him where it was and what he should look for? And were there any other modern technique kind of history places in Big Bear? And I thought that at this point he would probably enjoy meeting Eldon. So we set up breakfast for Eldon and John close to Eldon's house. It turned out to be close to John's hotel. And Eldon got back really late from breakfast because I think John walked in with notebooks, and I think that they were still there at lunchtime.
That's typical.
And of all of the people that I introduced to Eldon, John made the biggest splash. Eldon really liked John, and they had some really great conversations.
Oh, cool. You mentioned, you needed a good friend, and then you also needed the nemesis. There's perhaps now a revisionist perception that the 5 combat masters who were in this picture, this famous picture and everything, that they're all buddies.
Yeah, I get that a lot. They only became friends later in life. They were fierce competitors and looked at each other as enemies. And them being friendly and exchanging techniques. Now, that didn't happen. There's one case of a July 1961 case where Eldon has come to the match shooting two-handed, something only Jack Weaver had been doing, since 1959. In 1961, Eldon was the first person to also shoot two-handed, and they were both standing in front of the scoreboard. Jack had beaten Eldon by a couple of points, but was looking kind of uneasy at Eldon, and Eldon interpreted that as, well, somebody else, has picked up my idea here, and I won't have that advantage over everybody like I have for 2 years. And they engaged in a little bit of conversation, asking, how long have you been shooting two-handed? And everybody was very tight-lipped. Nobody wanted to exchange any information about, how they were winning matches. That was kind of forbidden. You didn't ask. And that kind of held back the development of the modern technique. Colonel Cooper and John Plan, another competitor who had a background in physical education, were trying to figure out what it was that the people that were winning the pistol matches were doing to win. And they never walked up and said, hey, what are you doing and why do you think that works? That would have been cheating. Both Cooper and Plan were also competitors in this, and it would be, asking, hey, you're beating me. How are you doing that so that I can beat you? Just wasn't done. And the classic example is Eldon was a quick draw artist. And part of quick draw is fancy gun handling to impress the audience. And in combat competition, the rules were basically, no rolling and flipping of the pistols. And you couldn't hold Eldon back. He was going to work a fancy gun handling technique in. And so he had introduced Hensley and Gibb number 68 semi-wad cutters to combat competition. He wanted a lighter bullet for less recoil, and he wanted better terminal performance. And hollow points of the era didn't work. You needed to drive them at least 1,000 feet per second, and you weren't going to get that in a 1911. So conventional wisdom of the time was that you needed a semi-wad cutter bullet for good terminal performance. So Eldon had a 1911 built that had the feedway throated to feed semi-wad cutter bullets, but it still was kind of black magic to get a 1911 to feed semi-wad cutter bullets. And you had to play with magazine feed lips, and you had to polish the feed ramp on the frame and the barrel. And it wasn't an every time thing. There were still feeding problems. So Eldon took to locking his slide back. Here on my training gun, he would lock his slide back, put a magazine in, and then he would reach his thumb into the trigger guard and push the slide back with his index finger and let it go forward. And he was doing a little bit of fancy gun handling with that. Thumb in the trigger guard, push the slide back and let it go forward. Colonel Cooper and John Plan are standing on the side trying to figure out what Eldon's doing. And what they thought that he was doing was what became the press check. He was checking to make sure, see if the chamber was loaded by working the slide back with his index finger. And so Jeff Cooper gives credit to Elden Carl for inventing the press check. And Eldon said, yeah, that's a good idea, and started doing press check. Eldon was horrified to find out later that his individual fancy gun handling was being taught. And when people started losing the tips of their fingers because their thumb inside the trigger guard was pressing the trigger while their thumb was in front of the muzzle, just absolutely horrified Eldon. But Colonel Cooper thought he was doing a press check, and Eldon said, yeah, that's a good idea. And he started doing press checks. But it was how he closed the slide on his auto pistol. That was his little individualized fancy gun handling, something left over from his quick draw days.
That's very interesting. And I'm sitting here thinking about, all the techniques that came out of that era. What might be different if they had all sat down around a table and actually had a discussion about what each other was doing, and if that had become the basis for the modern technique versus, and I'm not trying to denigrate Mr. Cooper, Mr. Flynn by any means, them standing over there watching and trying to figure out what somebody's doing.
Yeah, the 5 original combat masters were some very, very experienced and knowledgeable gunmen, and some very interesting things might have come out of that. But the truth was that they were 5 furious competitors trying to beat each other. They wanted to win the leather slap. They wanted to win the monthly meet for the Bear Valley Gunslingers. And after 1963, they wanted to win the Southwest Pistol League championship. But these were the guys that taught Jeff Cooper. And Jeff Cooper taught them, but it was not through a class. People can't see Jeff Cooper as anything except the guru at Gunsight, conducting classes. And these matches were basically Jeff Cooper's classes for him to learn. And his teachers were the other competitors there. So I've come to think of Jack Weaver, Ray Chapman, Phil Reed, and Elden Carl as the guys that Jeff Cooper learned from. And that's my particular area of interest, is the history of the modern technique before Jeff Cooper became the guru. And I've always said that if you're trying to study any particular problem in pistol shooting, the place you should start with is, what did Jeff Cooper say about that topic? Right. Now my mantra is to paraphrase a Watergate investigation, term. What did Colonel Cooper know, and when did he know it, and who taught it to him? And so I spend lots of time reading on Cooper's influences. One of his big influence was, the other 4 original combat masters. And, the rollover prone technique of Ray Chapman, the Chapman speed loading technique, the Cooper speed kneeling, were all things that were created in competition and worked their way into the modern technique of the pistol.
Those 5 guys, and, Mr. Flynn somehow gets forgotten amongst those names, as in common parlance a lot of times. Are there any other names from those early days that people should be aware of?
The one guy that seems to have disappeared, another multiple champion, and now I'm blanking on his name, Al Nichols. Al Nichols came in as champion of the Southwest Pistol League in 1965, and won, I think, 6 times between 65 and 75. 6 times, 5 or 6 times, I can never remember. huge influence on the development of the modern technique, and seems to have dropped off the face of the earth. Another guy from the San Diego area. At one point, San Diego was kind of the epicenter of combat pistol shooting in the United States, particularly the sheriff's department. The sheriff in those days was a guy by the name of John O'Connor, who was an old-fashioned Western lawman. When he got elected, he was the El Cajon police chief that hired Elden. When John O'Connor got elected sheriff of San Diego County, he brought Elden over to the sheriff's department. Elden became a public relations, officer and a range master under John O'Connor, and put in charge of firearms training. There was room for civilian volunteers, and Bill McMillan, the famed Marine who was the Olympic competitor, came and taught basic marksmanship. There was and I'll blank on his name too, a well-known gun writer of the time was a ballistics consultant to the sheriff's department, and wrote a book on combat shooting that features Elden and Sheriff O'Connor and Bill McMillan and Al Nichols, because San Diego was such a hotbed of combat shooting in the era of 1960 to 1975. The sheriff's department was running some cutting edge training for that time period.
Okay. Did Mr. Carl win the leather slaps with a 1911 each year? Did he win any of those with a revolver?
So the first year, he figured that he had been doing so much training at the academy with his Model 19 that he should bring a Model 19 to the leather slap. And that worked out very well for him. The thousands of rounds he had just fired in the police academy served him well. So Model 19 in 1960, between 60 and 61, he bought a $15 NRA 1911 and took it to an aviation ordnance chief by the name of Charlie Frazier. And Charlie Frazier was the head of the gunsmithing unit for the Navy's small arms training unit at Camp Matthews in San Diego. Camp Matthews used to be a much larger base, and half of it had been given to the county. And so the sheriff's department put their firearms training unit at Camp Matthews. The Navy had their match competition teams there, supported by a gunsmithing unit. So the sheriff's department and the Navy were co-located there. And when the Navy needed something, Elden would provide it. And when Elden needed something, the Navy would provide it. And he had done them enough favors that Charlie Frazier said, hey, if you'll pay for parts, I'll do the labor on your 1911. So Elden had a match conditioned 1911 courtesy of Charlie Frazier. And if anybody out there who has an expensive 1911 habit, blame it on Elden Carl, because he was the first person to show up in combat competition with a match condition 1911. And it had a Smith & Wesson K-frame revolver sight mounted on it. It was throated and ported. The slide was pinched onto the frame. It had stippling on the front strap. It had trigger work. It had a tight bushing, but it did not have a match barrel. And one of the stories that Elden would tell over and over again was how stupid he was not to pay the $15 and get the match barrel. In July 1961, Elden shows up at a Bear Valley Gunslingers monthly match where they're going to shoot Jeff Cooper's advanced military combat course, something that he had created right after auditing the FBI new agent firearms course in 1947. He and a fellow firearms enthusiastic officer by the name of Howland Taft, and he created a course that ended up being put in FM 2335, dated February 1953. And it was basically Jeff Cooper taking all of the lessons that he had learned from the FBI and from a review of all of the pistol shooting literature that the Marine Corps had, which included some Fairbairn and Sykes material from, were they Shanghai?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, so the Shanghai revolution in pistol shooting all worked its way into the advanced military combat course. It was a course of fire for experienced shooters who were tired of shooting the regular military qualification. It included 50-yard timed fire, 50-yard freestyle, no time limit, 25 yards against multiple targets with very short time limits. It had point shooting at 7 yards. Pretty revolutionary for military stuff at the time, which was based on bullseye shooting. So they're going to shoot this course. Eldon had told everyone that it was too expensive to put a match barrel in the gun. Charlie Frazier, his gunsmith, said, "Oh my, don't shoot at 50 yards with a non match barrel. It'll be like a shotgun pattern." But Eldon ignored him and went ahead and shot the match. At the end of the match, he and Jack Weaver get up to the scoreboard, and he's lost to Jack Weaver by like 2 points, and he is beating himself up about the 2 points, saying, "Charlie Frazier told me I should have gotten that match barrel. That match barrel would have been worth 2 points." So he immediately had the match barrel put in his 1911. But brings me back to one other point I wanted to make. Jack Weaver introduced the two-handed hold in 1959, and the Colonel has written in his histories of the modern technique that Jack Weaver showed us the way in 1959, and we never looked back. And when Colonel Cooper has 2 paragraphs to cover 35 years of pistol developments, that's about all that you get on it. And Eldon said it's a little bit more involved in that. He said Jack Weaver started shooting two-handed in August of 1959, and it wasn't until July 1961 that anybody else shot two-handed. It was Eldon in that advanced military combat course run by the Bear Valley Gunslingers. And Eldon said that everybody abused Jack for 2 years. And he said, Jack really suffered for his art, that everybody laughed at him, talked behind his back, thought he was, an odd guy. And Eldon said, all I could think of was he was beating us. Yep. Everybody else was criticizing, him for being silly, and nobody was going, he's beating us with his silly two-handed stance. Maybe we need to look at that. So I want to write an article about that match. And I want to call it The Day That Everything Changed, because everybody walked up. There were now 2 people shooting two-handed, and they were coming in first and second. And Eldon said as he stood off to the side, drinking water, that Colonel Cooper walked up and looked at the score and kind of hung his head and got a firm set to his jaw and walked off. And the next match in August of 1961, or excuse me, it would have been probably September. Everybody else, including Colonel Cooper, had Colonel Cooper had a two-handed game, and several other people had a two-handed game. So that July 1961 Advanced Military Combat Course was the day where everything changed. 2 years of Jack Weaver shooting two-handed by himself. Eldon joins, and then the next regularly scheduled match, there were several people who had a two-handed game. And that's really, again, where the day where everything changed.
And they're both using a two-handed grip, but it's not the same two-handed grip and stance.
It's very different. And Eldon's grip very closely resembles the modern isosceles. And very, very few, if any, people picked up on Eldon's grip until Latham and Enos brought it to everyone's attention in the early 80s. But Eldon will tell you, I invented absolutely nothing. He said, there's only so many ways that you can put your hands on a pistol, two hands on a pistol, and you're limited by the surfaces you have, and you're limited by the ways that your hands will bend. So when I showed him pictures from Shooting to Live by Fairbairn and Sykes, there's a diagram of hand placement that looks just like Eldon's. That book was not something that Eldon had ever seen. It was fairly limited production. Colonel Cooper probably had seen it because it was reproduced as part of a British commando manual from World War II that Cooper mentions having seen among the material at Quantico that he reviewed when he was putting together the Advanced Military Combat Course. But Eldon had never seen the book. And when I showed him the pictures for the diagrams from the 1930s, he said, boy, am I glad I never claimed to have invented that, because these guys, preceded me by about 20 years. And there are lots of old photographs out there that show similar stances to both Weaver and isosceles. So Eldon would tell you that he didn't invent anything. He said that he was fairly chagrined when he tried to duplicate Jack Weaver's two-handed stance with the thumb over, and the slide came back and sliced him good. And he said, okay, that's not going to work for an auto pistol. So he had to do something with that thumb to get it out of the way of the slide. So Eldon always gave Jack credit for the two-handed hold for the revolver, and he took credit for the two-handed hold for the auto pistol himself.
There you go. You talk about those old videos and pictures. Yeah, I've seen footage of, or pictures of, a British Army unit that was not associated with the Shanghai stuff, shooting what we would call an isosceles stance now, in the 40s.
The most famous picture of that is the Jedburgh's training at Milton Hall. The predecessor of American Special Forces is a joint British, American, and French unit known as the Jedburghs. They were fielded by the OSS and the SOE to coordinate efforts between the invading armies from Normandy and the French resistance. And they were made up of American, French officers and a radio operator. They were trained by Fairbairn and Sykes at Milton Hall, England. And he was teaching them the modern isosceles in 1944 before they jumped into France. And those guys had also been trained by Rex Applegate at Area B, which is now where Camp David, Maryland is. But the American portions of those units, the OSS guys, were trained by in Fairbairn and Sykes point shooting techniques prior to leaving the United States, and they got additional training at Arisag in Scotland and then at Milton Hall in England. But right out of that Fairbairn and Sykes manual, it shows a close approximation of the modern isosceles stance.
There you go. And it's funny how every 10 or 15 years, we got people that come up, they think they've invented something new, or they finally solved this question, or found the magic technique to fix everything. And then you show them a book from 15 years prior. Well,
Yeah.
This guy was doing this back then. I
think it's Dwayne Thomas wrote an article that said basically there is nothing new under the sun.
Right.
And we refine the ideas, but the ideas are very old.
Is there anything firearms equipment or technique related that you would like to, cover again about Mr. Carl?
Eldon was big into holsters, and in numerous conversations on holsters, every one of his holsters had a 15-degree forward rake. He thought that was real important for the speed of the draw. Remember, this is in the days before we had discovered that, a good chunk of American police officers killed were getting shot with their own guns. So at this point, speed was everything. That was how we were going to prevent police officers from getting killed on duty. So Eldon was designing holsters for speed. And that 15-degree forward rake was his contribution to that. Eldon would tell you that he knew all of the great holster makers while they were still working out of their garage. And John Bianchi was a good friend of Eldon's. And when Eldon was having John Bianchi make holsters for him, John was working out of his garage, and he had a couple of assistants that Eldon knew. One was Bruce Nelson and the other one was Gordon Davis. Bruce Nelson, of course, went on to his own company, building leather and instructing at Gunsight. And Gordon Davis, of course, went on to having Davis Leather, which was Nelson and Davis were very popular at Gunsight in the early days.
Yeah,
but,
and Nelson would be actually probably one of the, I guess, proponents of what we now call appendix carry, and he was doing that back in that era, and it's not new, folks.
Well, I also want to do an article called Secrets of the Modern Technique. And one of the secrets of the modern technique is that appendix carry was part of the modern technique, at least in 1974. And there is a 1961 book edited by Colonel Cooper that mentions appendix carry, 1961. So appendix carry has been part of the technique for a long, long time. And we've got the sources to show people that it was part of it. So Eldon, 15-degree forward rakes on holsters. He also had a competition-driven feature called a jump-up retaining strap. Colonel Cooper insisted, even in the leather slaps, that all holsters had to have some type of restraining device on the firearm. So Eldon's solution was an elastic strap that if you flipped it, it basically sprung off of the gun and onto the ground, and very fast. So Eldon's holster was an Alfonso of Hollywood Western police holster, and the holster and the belt are all in one unit. The holster is steel reinforced, so it's absolutely rigid on the hip. And then it has the jump off safety strap. Colonel Cooper designed his own holster several years later that was built by John Bianchi, called the Cooper Combat. And the Cooper Combat borrowed that same jump off safety strap. Very impractical for anything other than competition, but it was, a feature of holsters at the time. So Don Hume was working in his garage in Southern California. Eldon was buying holsters from him, having holsters customized. There was a local leather goods company in San Diego by the name of Triple K, and Elden did or authorized them to produce an Elden Carl signature model holster that featured his forward rake. And so again, Elden knew all of these guys when they were still sewing their holsters in their garages at their house in their off time. And his holsters were very, very popular competition. Hold on just a second.
Yep.
I'm back.
There you go.
Other pieces of equipment. We've talked about the magazine bumper pad.
Mm-hmm.
Eldon watched Colonel Cooper seat a 1911 magazine go to fire, and the magazine was not seated and fell out of the gun. And Eldon thought that an extension on the bottom of the magazine would be a good thing. So he went home and cut some aluminum stock and shaped it so that it would fit on the bottom of the magazines, and had them silver soldered into place, creating the first magazine bumper pad. We've already talked about Eldon and Hensley and Gibbs 68 bullets, holsters, match pistols in combat competition. He was a real equipment innovator.
All right. And then one other thing I need to ask about, because Gary Greco made me promise to get this in. He wasn't just a gun guy. He was a motorcycle guy as well.
Well, Eldon and I had lots of conversations about what it is about guys who were shooters and like motorcycles, and guys who like motorcycles and are shooters. And we came to the theory that it's the motorcycle is the modern horse, and we all just want to be cowboys and ride our horses and shoot our pistols. But Eldon was an expert in lightweight, single-cylinder off-road motorcycles that could also perform on paved surfaces. And Eldon's greatest pleasure in life was wearing out younger motorcycle riders in the corners. And that was another thing that he picked up from Colonel Cooper. His quote to me was, "I don't think Colonel Cooper ever taught me anything about guns, but he certainly taught me a lot about cornering." And Colonel Cooper was a sports car enthusiast and had written a book on the hobby of sports car racing. And in it is an extensive chapter on how to maneuver through corners. And so he gave Eldon a copy of his article on cornering, and the two of them talked about cornering a lot. And Eldon told me, in his 80s, he was still taking corners the way that Colonel Cooper taught him, back in the 60s, that Colonel Cooper was an expert driver and knew a lot about cornering. But Eldon's biggest pleasure in his 80s was defeating much younger riders in the corners. He goes, "They have faster bikes. I have one cylinder on my bike, but they slow down in the corners and I blow past them in the corners." Eldon rode every day sometimes better than 100 miles. There's a lot of dirt road in between San Diego and the border with Mexico, and Eldon knew every twist and turn of the mountains in between San Diego and the Mexican border, and he rode them every day. His big off-road competition in the 70s was the Tecate 500, and he raced it every year for about 10 years and was placed first at least once, but placed second and third several other times. So in the 1963-64 time period, the job with the sheriff's department was taking more and more of his time, and there was some resentment for him getting all of the weekends off to go do pistol competitions. So Eldon chose to emphasize his exhibition shooting business over combat pistol competition, and appeared less and less in competition from the 1963 leather slap on. The other thing you have to remember, that Colonel Cooper was trying to develop a sport in combat pistol shooting. I don't think he looked at it as much as a self-defense technique as a sport. I think him looking at it as a self-defense technique probably comes from closer to 1970. And when I say as a technique, something that he could teach and he could sell as a product, at a place like Gunsight. So in the early 60s, he's trying to keep the public interest in things like the leather slap. The leather slap, the Southwest Pistol League competitions, he looks at as spectator sports. The excitement in a spectator sport like that is not knowing who's going to win. And when you have somebody like Eldon or the other, 5 masters come in, exactly who's going to win, and it kind of takes the excitement out of the event. So in 1963, Colonel Cooper asked Eldon to sit out. I also want to point out the similarities. Colonel Cooper comes from a fencing background. He was on the fencing team at Stanford University, and he's a sword master at Stanford University. They have records of competitions. He's listed as one of their sword masters. And that's I think where the term combat master came from, is you achieve a certain level of skill. You became a sword master. With a pistol, you achieved a certain amount of skill. You became a combat master. In the sword fencing world, masters do not compete, masters teach. And I think that to keep the newness, the excitement in the sport of combat pistol shooting, people that won all the time, Colonel Cooper encouraged Eldon to sit out in 63, and more Eldon was being asked to administer matches rather than compete in matches. And Eldon kind of lost interest. He saw, the time that it was taking away from, work. He saw combat pistol shooting as costing him money versus exhibition shooting, which was making him money. And he pretty much had dropped out by the 1964 time period. But I said in our opening part, between 1960 and 63, 64, he owned the sport. He was multiple levels of champion. He was referred to as the king of combat shooting. Tremendously influential person in terms of getting the fledgling sport of combat shooting up and going.
There you go. Anything else that you want to add about him that I didn't ask about?
I think that's about it for an introductory talk.
Well, cool. Well, Jay, I thank you for coming on tonight. I very much have enjoyed all of the insight that you got offered, not only on Mr. Carl, but on the whole leather slap and the modern technique as it was developing. Um, what I hope this show does is help preserve the history and the context of where our art came from. And so I appreciate you adding to this library of information. And thank you very much for coming on and providing such good material.
Lee enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. And to the audience, I want to thank you again. The audience is continuing to grow. We are still 4 days left to go in this week, and we're 2 episode plays shy of our 30-day record. So I expect to break that record by the time this episode actually is released. So again, thank you all that are listening to the show. And as I like to say, share the link with your smart friends, but don't share it with your dumb ones. And thank you for your continued interest. And most of all, thank you for your time.